The October afternoon had settled over St. Mary Mead with that particular golden quality that makes English villages look as though they have been painted by someone with a deep affection for the subject. The annual Halloween pumpkin carnival stretched across the village green, a cheerful riot of orange bunting, carved jack-o'-lanterns, and the sort of organized chaos that occurs when the Women's Institute takes charge of festivities. Miss Jane Marple had positioned herself on her usual bench near the war memorial, her knitting needles moving with practiced rhythm while her mild blue eyes observed the proceedings with the quiet attention of someone who has learned that human nature reveals itself most clearly during moments of supposed celebration. The carnival had grown considerably since its modest beginnings, largely due to the enthusiastic patronage of Mr. Sebastian Hartwell, who had purchased Meadowbrook Manor 18 months prior. A distinguished gentleman in his early 60s with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command, Mr. Hartwell had thrown himself into village life with the fervor of a man seeking to establish his place in a community that measured worth in generations rather than bank balances. His pumpkin display dominated the center of the green, an impressive arrangement featuring specimens that would have done credit to a county show, crowned by an enormous gourd that required 2 men to lift. Miss Marple noted with interest how the villagers circulated around Mr. Hartwell's display. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, resplendent in a purple velvet cape that she fondly believed made her look mysterious, lingered nearby with the shameless curiosity of someone who collected gossip as other people collected stamps. Young Tommy Bond, who worked as Mr. Hartwell's gardener, hovered at the edge of the crowd with the uncomfortable expression of someone caught between loyalty and unease. Most intriguing was the presence of Miss Letitia Blacklock, the village's most reclusive resident, who rarely attended social gatherings but stood now at the periphery, her sharp eyes fixed on the newcomer with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest. The afternoon progressed with the familiar rhythm of village celebrations. Children in elaborate costumes darted between the stalls, while their parents exchanged the sort of meaningful glances that conveyed entire conversations about behavior, homework, and the rising cost of everything. Dr. Haydock had abandoned his professional dignity to attempt the ring toss, much to his wife's amused despair. The vicar, Reverend Clement, moved through the crowd with the slightly overwhelmed expression of a man whose wife had recently taken up what she called experimental bell arrangements and who lived in constant fear of what she might experiment with next. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a small drama unfolding near the apple-bobbing station. Mrs. Price Ridley's terrier had escaped its lead and was creating havoc among the carefully arranged harvest displays, while its owner pursued it with the sort of breathless indignation that suggested this was not an isolated incident. As the chaos subsided and order was restored, Miss Marple noticed Mr. Hartwell's reaction to the disturbance. Rather than the tolerant amusement one might expect from a man secure in his position, there had been a flash of something harder in his pale blue eyes, quickly suppressed but unmistakably present. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the green, the atmosphere grew more festive. Lanterns were lit, creating pools of warm yellow light that flickered across animated faces. The evening's entertainment was to culminate with the judging of the costume competition and the ceremonial lighting of the harvest bonfire, followed by the traditional telling of ghost stories that would send the children home with deliciously frightened shivers and ensure a brisk trade in night lights. It was then that the scream cut through the cheerful chatter like a blade through silk. Not the delighted shriek of a child startled by a harmless prank, but the genuine terror of someone who had encountered something truly horrifying. The sound came from the direction of Mr. Hartwell's prized pumpkin display, where a small crowd had gathered for the evening's ceremonial judging. Miss Marple rose from her bench with surprising alacrity for someone of her years, her knitting forgotten as she moved toward the commotion. The crowd was parting like water, revealing what lay at the center of the magnificent display. Mr. Sebastian Hartwell lay motionless among his prize pumpkins, his distinguished features frozen in an expression of profound surprise. A carved jack-o'-lantern grinned mockingly beside his still form, its candle flickering in the evening breeze like a malevolent eye. The transformation was immediate and complete. The cheerful sounds of celebration died away, replaced by gasps, choked sobs, and the rising murmur of shocked voices. Children, sensing the sudden shift in adult behavior, began to cry. The spell of the Halloween pumpkin carnival was utterly broken, its innocent joy replaced by something far darker. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the gathering crowd, her expression outwardly calm but her mind already working with the methodical precision that had solved so many puzzles in the past. Her eyes missed nothing. The way Mrs. Bantry's face had gone chalk white, the manner in which Tommy Bond instinctively stepped backward, the almost imperceptible flinch that crossed Miss Blacklock's sharp features. The village had just been irrevocably altered, its veneer of peaceful routine shattered by an act that transformed their innocent celebration into something altogether more sinister. The news of Sebastian Hartwell's death spread through St. Mary Mead with the peculiar velocity that accompanies truly shocking events in small communities. Within moments of Dr. Haydock's grim confirmation, the cheerful carnival atmosphere dissolved into something far more sinister. The carved pumpkins, so festive moments before, now seemed to leer with malevolent grins as shadows lengthened across the village green. Sergeant Finch arrived with commendable speed, his bicycle clattering to a halt near the war memorial. A man more accustomed to settling disputes over property boundaries than investigating sudden death, he approached the scene with visible trepidation. His first act was to disperse the growing crowd of onlookers, though this proved rather like attempting to herd cats, as each villager felt they possessed some vital insight that required immediate sharing. "Everyone step back, please," Finch called, his voice carrying the authority of his uniform if not his experience. "This is now a police matter." He surveyed the scene with the methodical care of someone following procedures learned from a manual, noting the position of the body, the surrounding pumpkins, and the trampled earth that might once have held useful evidence. Miss Marple positioned herself strategically near Mrs. Sweeterman's information booth, where the convergence of official activity and village curiosity created an ideal observatory for human nature in its most unguarded state. From this vantage point, she could observe not only the investigation, but the reactions of those who had known the deceased. Mrs. Bantry, still pale from her initial shock, had recovered sufficiently to begin her analysis of the situation. "Mark my words, this was no accident," she declared to anyone within earshot. "Sebastian was a careful man, not given to stumbling about in the dark. Someone wanted him dead." Her pronouncement carried the weight of someone who had read every mystery novel in the lending library and considered herself something of an expert on criminal behavior. Young Tommy Bond, who had been dispatched to telephone Inspector Craddock from Much Benham, returned looking distinctly unsettled. His usual cheerful demeanor had vanished entirely, replaced by a nervous energy that manifested in constantly shifting glances and fidgeting hands. When Mrs. Price Ridley questioned him about his employer's recent mood, his responses were notably evasive. "Can't say I noticed anything particular, ma'am," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact. Mr. Hartwell kept his business to himself mostly. Always polite, mind you, but not one for sharing confidences with the help. Miss Marple noted the slight emphasis on the help and the bitter undertone that suggested their relationships had been more complex than simple employer and employee courtesy. Miss Letitia Blacklock's presence at the scene was perhaps the most surprising development of the evening. The reclusive woman rarely attended village functions, preferring the solitude of her cottage to the social obligations of community life. Yet here she stood, her sharp eyes taking in every detail with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest. "Tragic, certainly," she observed when approached by the vicar's wife, "though I confess I'm not entirely surprised. Mr. Hartwell was a man who made enemies easily. Success in the city often comes at a price, and that price sometimes follows one into retirement. Her words, delivered with characteristic precision, sent ripples of speculation through the gathered crowd. Dr. Haydock completed his preliminary examination with professional efficiency, though his findings offered little immediate comfort. "No obvious signs of violence," he reported to Sergeant Finch in tones meant to be private, but clearly audible to nearby listeners. "Could be natural causes, though the circumstances are certainly suspicious. We'll need a proper post-mortem to determine the exact cause." The suggestion of natural causes did little to dampen the village's appetite for more dramatic explanations. Theories began to proliferate with remarkable creativity. Mrs. Price Ridley favored poison, citing Mr. Hartwell's fondness for exotic chocolates. The baker's wife suggested a romantic entanglement gone wrong, while Reverend Clement's wife had developed an elaborate narrative involving financial irregularities and vengeful business partners. Miss Marple listened to these theories with the patient attention of someone separating wheat from chaff. More interesting than the theories themselves were the theorists, each revealing their own preoccupations and prejudices through their preferred explanations. She noted who seemed genuinely shocked by the death and who appeared to be performing their surprise for public consumption. As Inspector Craddock arrived from Much Benham, bringing with him the authority and experience that Sergeant Finch lacked, the investigation began to take on a more professional character. The inspector, a competent man with a methodical approach to criminal investigation, immediately set about securing the scene and beginning preliminary interviews with potential witnesses. The physical evidence, such as it was, painted a frustratingly incomplete picture. Mr. Hartwell had been found among his prized pumpkins, apparently having collapsed while examining his display. There were no obvious weapons, no signs of struggle, nothing to definitively suggest foul play beyond the simple fact of an unexpectedly dead man in circumstances that seemed to invite suspicion. By the time the body was removed and the crowd had reluctantly dispersed, St. Mary Mead had been fundamentally altered. The Halloween decorations, so cheerful in daylight, now cast eerie shadows in the lamplight. The village had crossed an invisible threshold from innocence to something darker, and Miss Marple suspected that the truth, when it emerged, would prove more complex and disturbing than anyone yet imagined. As she made her way home through the quiet streets, Miss Marple reflected on the curious nature of the case beginning to unfold before her, knowing that tomorrow would bring new revelations and deeper mysteries. The morning after the Halloween pumpkin carnival dawned grey and subdued, as though the very weather reflected St. Mary Mead's altered disposition. Miss Marple rose early, as was her custom, and found herself drawn to her kitchen window where she could observe the comings and goings along the high street, while ostensibly arranging her late chrysanthemums. The rhythms of village life continued, but with a nervous energy that spoke of whispered conversations and sideways glances. Inspector Craddock had established his temporary headquarters in the village hall, transforming the cheerful space where the Women's Institute held their meetings into something altogether more serious. Miss Marple noted with interest the steady stream of residents making their way to what had become an informal interrogation center. Each emerged with a slightly dazed expression of someone who had been required to account for their movements and motivations to official authority, a process that invariably revealed more than intended about both the questioner and the questioned. Mrs. Bantry was among the first to be interviewed, her purple cape from the previous evening replaced by a more subdued navy ensemble that nonetheless failed to diminish her natural theatrical tendencies. She emerged from the hall with the satisfied air of someone who had provided valuable intelligence to the authorities, though Miss Marple suspected that Mrs. Bantry's enthusiasm for detective work might exceed her actual observational skills. "The inspector is very thorough," Mrs. Bantry announced to the small crowd that had gathered outside the post office. "Asked me all sorts of questions about poor Sebastian's habits and associations. I told him about those telephone calls he'd been receiving. 3 times this past week, I saw him hurrying to answer with the most peculiar expression. Not pleased, mind you, but not exactly worried either. More like someone preparing for an unpleasant but necessary conversation. Miss Marple found this observation intriguing, particularly when considered alongside her own recollections of Mr. Hartwell's behavior at recent village functions. There had been a quality of watchfulness about him, a tendency to scan faces in crowds as though searching for someone specific. Young Tommy Bond's interview had clearly been more challenging. He emerged from the hall looking distinctly shaken, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by the haunted expression of someone forced to confront uncomfortable truths. When Miss Marple encountered him later near the churchyard, her approach was characteristically gentle. "Such a shock for you, Tommy," she observed, settling beside him on a weathered bench. "You worked so closely with Mr. Hartwell. I imagine you knew him better than most of us." Tommy's response was immediate and defensive. "Not really, Miss Marple. He kept himself to himself, mostly. Always. Polite, but not one for personal conversation." He paused, then added with unexpected bitterness. Though he was quick enough to criticize when something wasn't to his liking. Had very particular standards, did Mr. Hartwell. The criticism seemed to surprise Tommy himself, as though the words had emerged without conscious intention. Miss Marple noted the flush that spread across his features and the way his hands clenched involuntarily. The most significant development came through Mrs. Sweeterman at the post office, who possessed the detailed memory of someone who made it her business to notice such things. According to her account, Mr. Hartwell had received a letter on the morning of his death that had caused him considerable agitation. "He read it right there at the counter," Mrs. Sweeterman confided to Miss Marple during her afternoon visit. "Went quite pale, he did, then folded it very carefully and put it in his inside pocket. When I asked if everything was all right, he just smiled that polite smile of his and said something about old business coming home to roost. Gave me quite a chill, it did, the way he said it." The letter had not been found among Mr. Hartwell's effects, a fact that Inspector Craddock had noted with professional interest. Its disappearance suggested either that the deceased had disposed of it himself or that someone else had removed it, either possibility raising questions about its contents and significance. Miss Letitia Blacklock's interview had been notably brief, though Inspector Craddock emerged from it with a thoughtful expression. Miss Blacklock herself offered no insights to curious neighbors, maintaining her characteristic reserve with even greater determination than usual. However, Miss Marple observed that the reclusive woman had taken to walking past Meadowbrook Manor at unusual hours, her sharp eyes studying the property with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest. At Meadowbrook Manor itself, Miss Marple had encountered Mrs. Inez Vale, Mr. Hartwell's London acquaintance, who had been staying as his guest. A handsome woman with hair arranged too carefully for genuine bereavement, she possessed the sort of city sophistication that stood out sharply against the village backdrop. "He admired you, Miss Marple," Mrs. Vale had said with practiced smoothness. "Said you had the sort of sense money can't buy." She had smiled quickly, as if to get the expression over with. "I suppose there will be questions about wills?" "There always are." The lightness in her voice rang false, like a teacup set down in an empty room. Dr. Haydock's preliminary findings, shared in confidence with his wife and therefore known throughout the village by lunchtime, added another layer of complexity. The initial examination had revealed no obvious cause of death, though certain anomalies suggested the need for more detailed investigation. Most intriguingly, there were traces of what appeared to be organic matter under Mr. Hartwell's fingernails, despite his reputation for fastidious personal grooming. As evening approached, Miss Marple found herself reviewing the day's accumulated intelligence with the methodical care of someone assembling a particularly complex puzzle. The picture emerging was of a man who had not been quite what he seemed, whose carefully constructed image of successful retirement concealed currents of tension and unresolved conflict. The question was whether those tensions had been sufficient to drive someone to murder, and if so, who among the village's seemingly innocent residents possessed both motive and opportunity. Inspector Craddock approached his investigation with the methodical precision of a man who believed that most crimes revealed themselves through patient accumulation of evidence rather than brilliant deduction. By the morning of the third day, his attention had focused decisively upon Tommy Bond, whose nervous demeanor and evasive responses had marked him as the investigation's most promising lead. The transformation of Mr. Hartwell's death from mysterious collapse to probable murder had been confirmed by Dr. Haydock's preliminary findings, which revealed traces of digitalis in the deceased's system, a discovery that cast the Halloween tragedy in an altogether more sinister light. The evidence against Tommy possessed the sort of compelling logic that satisfied both police procedure and village expectation. His extensive knowledge of plants and their properties, gained through years of horticultural training, provided him with both the means and the expertise necessary to prepare a fatal dose of digitalis from the foxglove that grew abundantly throughout the manor's carefully tended gardens. More damaging still was the revelation of a heated argument between employer and employee just days before Mr. Hartwell's death, an exchange witnessed by Mrs. Price Ridley during one of her constitutional walks and reported with the satisfaction of someone whose nosiness had finally proved useful. Village opinion had crystallized around Tommy's guilt with the swift certainty that characterizes small communities confronted with shocking events. Mrs. Bantry, embracing her role as unofficial spokesperson for local sentiment, pronounced it just like a young man to lose his head over money troubles, while others recalled Tommy's sullen moods following his confrontation with Mr. Hartwell and the way he had avoided eye contact in recent days. The narrative of the wronged employee, driven to desperate measures by financial pressure, possessed an appealing simplicity that seemed to restore order to their disrupted world. The motive, as Inspector Craddock had reconstructed it, centered on Tommy's mounting financial difficulties. Investigation had revealed a series of pressing debts, including expenses for his mother's medical treatment that had strained his modest gardener's wages beyond their limits. Mr. Hartwell's refusal to advance the promised payment for a challenging landscaping project had apparently pushed the young man beyond endurance, creating the sort of desperate circumstances that could drive even decent people to terrible acts. Miss Marple observed these developments with the quiet attention of someone who had learned to distrust solutions that arrived too readily. From her position during morning service, she watched as whispered conversations ceased abruptly when Tommy entered the church, noting how the young man's shoulders hunched defensively under the weight of collective suspicion. His distress, while evident, seemed to her to possess a quality of genuine shock and grief rather than the calculated remorse of someone attempting to conceal guilt. Her concerns deepened during a chance encounter with Tommy near the village green, where the remnants of Halloween decorations still fluttered forlornly in the autumn breeze. The young man's appearance had deteriorated markedly since Mr. Hartwell's death, his usually neat clothing now rumpled and his face bearing the hollow-eyed look of someone who had not been sleeping well. "Miss Marple," he said with evident relief, as though her familiar presence offered refuge from the suspicion that surrounded him elsewhere. "I suppose you've heard what they're saying about me." His voice carried the flat resignation of someone who had accepted the inevitability of his fate. Tommy's response to her gentle questioning revealed complexities that the official investigation had apparently overlooked. The argument with Mr. Hartwell had indeed occurred, but its subject had been far more personal than professional disagreement. Tommy had discovered something about his employer's past that had shaken his faith in the man's character, leading to a confrontation that had ended with harsh words on both sides. "He wasn't what he seemed, Miss Marple," Tommy said with quiet intensity. "All that talk about successful retirement from the city, about wanting to contribute to village life. There were things about his past, things that would have shocked people if they'd known. I told him he ought to come clean, make things right with those he'd wronged. He laughed at me, said I was naive to think the world worked that way. Meanwhile, Inspector Craddock had made a discovery in the Manor's potting shed that seemed to seal Tommy's fate. Hidden behind a stack of seed trays was a small brown bottle without a label, containing traces of what appeared to be plant extract with a distinctly medicinal odor. When confronted with this evidence, Tommy's explanation that it contained plant food rang hollow, particularly given his inability to account for why it had been concealed rather than stored with his other gardening supplies. The physical evidence continued to accumulate in ways that painted an increasingly damning picture. The Halloween Carnival had provided perfect cover for administering poison, possibly through the mulled cider that had circulated freely among the celebrants. Tommy's presence at the festivities would have aroused no suspicion, while his knowledge of Mr. Hartwell's habits would have made targeting his victim relatively straightforward. Miss Marple found herself troubled by the neat progression of evidence, though she could not immediately articulate the source of her unease. The case against Tommy possessed the sort of logical completeness that often characterized false solutions, where each piece of evidence supported a predetermined conclusion without allowing for alternative interpretations. Her experience had taught her that real crimes rarely unfolded with such convenient clarity, and that the most dangerous killers were often those who understood how to direct suspicion toward convenient scapegoats. As Inspector Craddock prepared for Tommy's formal arrest, Miss Marple remained unconvinced that justice was about to be served. The arrest of Tommy Bunn proceeded with the sort of administrative efficiency that Inspector Craddock brought to all his professional duties, though Miss Marple observed with interest that the young man's reaction suggested genuine bewilderment rather than the relief that sometimes accompanied capture after mounting pressure. She had positioned herself near the village green when the police car arrived, ostensibly tending to the last of the carnival cleanup, but actually watching the human drama unfold with the careful attention of someone who understood that truth often revealed itself in unguarded moments. Tommy's protests carried the ring of authentic shock rather than calculated denial. "I never hurt him, Miss Marple," he called out as he was led to the waiting vehicle, his voice breaking slightly. "Whatever they think they know, there's something wrong here, something nobody's seeing properly." His words were lost in the general murmur of village satisfaction at seeing justice apparently served, though Miss Marple filed them away with the methodical care she brought to all potentially significant observations. With Tommy safely in custody, St. Mary Mead began the process of returning to its normal rhythms, though the Halloween tragedy had left subtle alterations in the fabric of daily life. Mrs. Bantry held court at the post office, regaling anyone who would listen with her theories about the psychological pressures that had driven Tommy to his desperate act, while others spoke with the peculiar satisfaction that comes from having witnessed dramatic events while remaining safely removed from their consequences. It was during this period of apparent resolution that Miss Marple made the discovery that would transform her understanding of the case entirely. Returning to the village green under the pretense of collecting forgotten knitting, she found herself drawn once again to the spot where Mr. Hartwell had fallen. The area had been thoroughly examined by the police, but Miss Marple had learned that official investigations, however competent, sometimes overlooked details that seemed insignificant to trained minds but spoke volumes to those who understood the small betrayals of human behavior. Her attention focused on the jack-o'-lantern that had grinned so mockingly beside the deceased's body. Something about its position had troubled her subconsciously since that terrible evening, and now examining it more carefully, she understood why. The pumpkin showed clear evidence of having been moved after its candle was lit, the hardened wax trails inside forming patterns inconsistent with its current position. More intriguingly, tucked beneath the jagged carved mouth, her careful fingers discovered a small fragment of paper, so faintly perfumed that she might have imagined it, bearing the unmistakable smear of peacock blue sealing wax. This discovery led Miss Marple to reconsider her observations of Mrs. Inez Vale, Mr. Hartwell's London guest, whose composure had struck her as containing more anticipation than grief. A subsequent visit to Meadowbrook Manor, undertaken under the charitable pretense of helping sort the deceased's effects, revealed Mrs. Vale's elegant writing case with its neat arrangement of stationery, brass seal, and stick of wax in that distinctive peacock blue shade. The coincidence seemed too precise to ignore, particularly when combined with Mrs. Vale's obvious familiarity with the manor's layout and her curious lack of surprise at the tragic turn of events. However, it was among Mr. Hartwell's personal papers that Miss Marple encountered the detail that would prove most significant. Hidden within a leather-bound appointment diary was an entry made just 3 days before his death, written in his characteristic neat script, L.B. Final Settlement, followed by a time and the notation, Private Matter Resolved. The initials could refer to only one person in St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple found herself reconsidering everything she thought she understood about Miss Letitia Blacklock's relationship with the deceased. A delicate inquiry with Mrs. Sweetyman at the post office revealed information about Miss Blacklock's past that cast her current circumstances in an entirely different light. The reclusive woman had once enjoyed a successful career in London's financial district, living well until something had driven her back to St. Mary Mead 15 years earlier, apparently with significantly reduced means. Her attendance at the Halloween Carnival, so unusual for someone who typically avoided social gatherings, took on new significance when viewed as a deliberate decision rather than social awkwardness. Miss Marple recalled Miss Blacklock's precise knowledge of Mr. Hartwell's character, her unsurprised reaction to suggestions of his having made enemies, and her purposeful movements near the refreshment area during the carnival. What had seemed like social discomfort now appeared potentially more calculated, the actions of someone accomplishing a specific task rather than wandering aimlessly through an unfamiliar social situation. The digitalis that had killed Mr. Hartwell grew abundantly throughout the village, including in Miss Blacklock's carefully tended garden. More significantly, someone with financial training would possess the methodical mind capable of calculating precise dosages and understanding the delayed action that would provide an alibi through careful timing. While Tommy's horticultural knowledge had made him an obvious suspect, Miss Blacklock's background suggested different but equally relevant expertise in planning and execution. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple found herself contemplating a solution far more complex than the straightforward case of employer and employee that had satisfied Inspector Craddock. The threads of evidence were beginning to weave themselves into a pattern that suggested careful premeditation, long-standing grievances, and the sort of methodical revenge that could only come from someone who had been planning their moment for years. The arrest of Tommy Bond had settled over St. Mary Mead like a heavy blanket, muffling the villagers' natural curiosity while providing the comfortable illusion that justice had been served. Yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by the neat progression of evidence that had led to the young man's detention. Her years of observing human nature had taught her that real crimes rarely unfolded with such convenient clarity, and she remained convinced that the true story lay buried beneath layers of misdirection and carefully constructed appearances. It was during her methodical re-examination of the crime scene that Miss Marple made the discovery that would transform her understanding entirely. The fragment of peacock blue sealing wax she had found beneath the jack-o'-lantern, so easily overlooked in the initial investigation, proved to be far more significant than anyone had realized. A discreet inquiry at the village stationer's confirmed that Mrs. Inez Vale was the only recent purchaser of that distinctive shade, a detail that cast her presence at Meadowbrook Manor in an entirely different light. The elegant London woman's behavior since Mr. Hartwell's death had struck Miss Marple as containing more calculation than genuine grief. Her immediate concerns about the will, her practiced composure during police questioning, and her obvious familiarity with the manor's layout all suggested someone who had been preparing for this eventuality rather than someone shocked by unexpected tragedy. The sealing wax fragment indicated that correspondence had been exchanged, possibly the very letter that Mrs. Sweetyman had observed causing Mr. Hartwell such agitation on the morning of his death. However, it was the mysterious diary entry, L.B., Final Settlement, that opened an even more compelling line of investigation. Miss Marple's gentle inquiries had revealed that Miss Letitia Blacklock's reclusive nature concealed a past far more complex than the village had imagined. The sharp-featured woman had once enjoyed a successful career in London's financial district until a scandal 15 years earlier had destroyed both her professional reputation and her comfortable circumstances, driving her into rural exile. Through careful research disguised as genealogical interest, Miss Marple uncovered the true nature of the connection between Miss Blacklock and Sebastian Hartwell. The financial irregularities that had ended Miss Blacklock's career had been orchestrated by Hartwell himself, who had manipulated client funds while ensuring that suspicion fell upon his more vulnerable colleague. Miss Blacklock's gender and modest background had made her a convenient scapegoat for losses that actually resulted from Hartwell's deliberate fraud. The recent correspondence Miss Blacklock had been receiving from London solicitors concerned new evidence that would have cleared her name and revealed Hartwell's culpability. This vindication came with the possibility of substantial financial compensation, creating a cruel irony in their reunion within St. Mary Mead's boundaries. Hartwell's retirement to the village had been motivated by his need to escape the consequences of financial dealings that were finally attracting regulatory attention, making Miss Blacklock's presence an unwelcome reminder of past crimes. The appointment diary entry now revealed its true significance as evidence of a final confrontation between victim and perpetrator. Hartwell's notation about resolving a private matter suggested his belief that he had successfully negotiated some accommodation with his former victim, perhaps through threats or promises designed to preserve his carefully constructed new identity. Other villagers began to reveal their own troubling experiences with the deceased once the initial shock had subsided. Mrs. Bantry confided that Hartwell had acquired a valuable painting from her late husband's collection for what she now suspected was far below its true worth. Reverend Clement expressed unease about the conditional nature of Hartwell's charitable contributions, noting an expectation of deference that suggested someone seeking absolution for unspecified wrongs. Dr. Haydock's re-examination of the physical evidence provided additional insights that supported Miss Marple's growing suspicions. The traces of organic matter beneath Hartwell's fingernails had been identified as pumpkin flesh, despite his reputation for fastidious grooming. This discovery, combined with the fact that the jack-o'-lantern had been moved after its candle was lit, suggested that the carved pumpkin had served as more than mere decoration. Someone had used the festival's chaos to hide evidence or plant clues, taking advantage of the carnival atmosphere to accomplish their purpose unobserved. Miss Blacklock's attendance at the Halloween carnival, so uncharacteristic of her usual behavior, began to appear less like social awkwardness and more like the careful execution of a long-considered plan. Her knowledge of Hartwell's habits, gained through months of purposeful observation during her walks past the manor, would have provided all the information necessary to ensure that justice was finally served on her own terms. As Miss Marple assembled these various threads of evidence, she realized that Tommy Bond's arrest had been the result of a masterfully orchestrated deception. The real killer possessed not only the motive and opportunity for murder, but also the intelligence and patience to direct suspicion toward a convenient scapegoat. The question now was how to prove her theory without alerting the true perpetrator that their carefully planned revenge was beginning to unravel. Miss Marple's investigation had reached that delicate stage where intuition begins to crystallize into certainty, though she remained far too experienced to mistake preliminary conclusions for established fact. Her growing suspicions about Miss Letitia Blacklock required careful verification, and it was during what appeared to be an entirely innocent encounter at the village post office that she obtained the confirmation she sought. Miss Blacklock had engaged Mrs. Sweeterman in animated conversation about botanical matters, demonstrating a surprisingly detailed knowledge of medicinal plants that extended far beyond casual gardening interest. The discussion centered on the therapeutic properties of common garden specimens, with Miss Blacklock displaying particular expertise regarding Digitalis purpurea and its various applications. When Mrs. Sweetyman expressed surprise at such specialized knowledge, Miss Blacklock explained that her London career had included extensive work with pharmaceutical investments, requiring detailed understanding of drug development and therapeutic dosages. The explanation was perfectly reasonable, yet Miss Marple noted the slight tension in Miss Blacklock's voice and the way her fingers drummed nervously against the counter during the conversation. This revelation prompted Miss Marple to reconsider the timeline of events with renewed attention to detail. Dr. Haydock's refined analysis of the digitalis concentration suggested administration approximately 2 hours before death, placing the poisoning during the early afternoon rather than the evening carnival festivities. This timing eliminated most obvious suspects, including Tommy Bond, who had been occupied with setup duties under multiple witnesses throughout that crucial period. However, Miss Blacklock's movements during those same hours remained largely unaccounted for, with several villagers recalling her presence near the manor grounds during what she claimed was a routine constitutional walk. The most significant breakthrough came through Miss Marple's patient investigation into Mrs. Inez Vale's background, which revealed that the elegant London woman was far from the casual acquaintance she claimed to be. Hidden correspondence discovered among Hartwell's papers exposed Mrs. Vale as his former business partner, complicit in the financial manipulations that had destroyed Miss Blacklock's career 15 years earlier. Her presence at Meadowbrook Manor represented not social visiting but a desperate attempt to manage the crisis created by emerging evidence of their past crimes. The peacock blue sealing wax fragment took on new significance as evidence of coordination between the conspirators. Mrs. Vale's distinctive stationery had been used for correspondence that went beyond mere social pleasantries, possibly including arrangements for additional payments or other inducements designed to preserve their carefully constructed new identities. The fragment's presence at the crime scene suggested that incriminating letters had been destroyed as part of an elaborate cover-up, though not thoroughly enough to eliminate all traces. Miss Marple's understanding deepened when she learned that Hartwell's retirement to St. Mary Mead had been motivated by necessity rather than choice. Rather than seeking peaceful country living, he had been fleeing increasingly serious regulatory investigations into his London financial activities. The village location provided convenient isolation from former associates while maintaining the fiction of successful retirement. Miss Blacklock's presence had threatened this carefully constructed sanctuary, creating pressures that ultimately proved fatal. The mysterious diary entry, LB Final Settlement, now revealed its true significance as evidence of a confrontation that had not proceeded as smoothly as Hartwell's notation implied. The discrepancy between the scheduled appointment and the letter that had agitated Hartwell on the morning of his death suggested that their negotiation had required additional pressure to achieve the desired result. Mrs. Sweetyman's casual mention of seeing Miss Blacklock engaged in intense conversation with Hartwell near his pumpkin display just before the body's discovery added crucial confirmation to this theory. As Miss Marple assembled these various threads of evidence, she realized that Tommy Bond's arrest had been the result of a masterfully orchestrated deception. The real perpetrator possessed not only compelling motive and opportunity, but also the intelligence and patience to direct suspicion toward a convenient scapegoat. Miss Blacklock's 15 years in St. Mary Mead had provided perfect cover for extensive surveillance of her target, while her reclusive behavior had ensured that few villagers understood the true significance of Hartwell's arrival in their midst. The challenge now facing Miss Marple was how to expose this carefully planned revenge without alerting the conspirators that their elaborate cover story was beginning to unravel. The arrest of Tommy Bond had provided them with ideal protection, and they would undoubtedly resist any attempt to redirect the investigation toward its proper targets. Miss Marple knew that her next moves would require the utmost delicacy, for she was dealing with adversaries who had already demonstrated their willingness to destroy innocent lives in pursuit of their goals. Miss Marple's investigation had reached that crucial juncture where careful observation must give way to deliberate action, though she approached this transition with the same gentle precision that characterized all her methods. The arrest of Tommy Bond had provided the village with comfortable closure, yet she remained convinced that the true perpetrators were not only free but actively working to ensure their deception remained undetected. Her next move required the delicate application of psychological pressure, administered with such subtlety that her targets would reveal themselves without realizing they had been tested. The opportunity presented itself during the weekly parish council meeting, held in the vicarage drawing room where social conventions demanded polite discourse, even under the most trying circumstances. Miss Marple had specifically requested that the meeting include discussion of memorial arrangements for Mr. Hartwell, knowing that such a topic would require the attendance of both Miss Blacklock and Mrs. Vale while providing natural cover for pointed observations about the deceased's final days. Miss Blacklock arrived punctually, her sharp features composed in an expression of appropriate solemnity, though Miss Marple noted the slight tension around her eyes that suggested careful preparation for this public appearance. Mrs. Vale entered shortly afterward, her London elegance slightly diminished by the strain of maintaining her grieving friend persona for longer than originally anticipated. The two women acknowledged each other with the sort of careful politeness that often conceals deeper connections, a detail that did not escape Miss Marple's attention. As the meeting progressed through routine business, Miss Marple waited for the precise moment to introduce her carefully prepared test. When discussion turned to the proposed memorial garden, she spoke with her characteristic gentle authority. "It seems fitting that we should plant foxglove in Sebastian's memory," she observed, noting the immediate stiffening in Miss Blacklock's posture. "Such a beautiful flower, though of course one must be careful about its placement. The concentration of digitalis in the leaves can be quite dangerous if not properly understood. I've been reading about medieval herbalists who used it medicinally, though the margin between therapeutic and fatal doses is remarkably narrow." Miss Blacklock's response came too quickly, betraying knowledge that went far beyond casual gardening interest. "The therapeutic index is indeed critical," she said, then seemed to catch herself. "That is, I recall reading something similar during my London career when we handled pharmaceutical investments." Her attempt at casual explanation only emphasized the specialized nature of her knowledge. Mrs. Vale's contribution proved equally revealing. "Perhaps roses would be more appropriate," she suggested with forced lightness. "Sebastian always admired the ones by the manor's east wall, particularly during his morning walks." The detail was offered innocently enough, yet it demonstrated intimate knowledge of Hartwell's daily routines that contradicted her claims of casual acquaintance. Miss Marple pressed her advantage with apparent innocence. "How thoughtful of you to notice his preferences, Mrs. Vale. Though I confess I'm puzzled by something I observed that terrible evening. The jack-o'-lantern beside poor Sebastian seemed to have been moved after its candle was lit. The wax patterns inside were quite distinctive, suggesting it had been repositioned during the festivities. I wondered if perhaps someone had used it to conceal something temporarily." The effect was immediate and decisive. Miss Blacklock's hands, previously steady in her lap, betrayed the slightest tremor, while Mrs. Vale's carefully maintained composure slipped just enough to reveal genuine alarm. Most tellingly, both women exchanged a quick glance that spoke of shared knowledge and mutual concern. "The police examined everything thoroughly," Miss Blacklock said with forced confidence. "I'm sure any irregularities were noted and explained." Yet her voice carried an undertone of question rather than statement, as though seeking reassurance rather than providing it. Miss Marple smiled with gentle persistence. "Oh, I'm certain they were most thorough." though I did notice a small fragment of peacock blue sealing wax near the pumpkin display. Such a distinctive color, don't you think? It reminded me of the elegant stationery I've seen Mrs. Vale use for her correspondence. This final detail struck home with devastating accuracy. Mrs. Vale's face went pale, while Miss Blacklock's sharp intake of breath was audible in the sudden silence. The peacock blue sealing wax was known only to those involved in the crucial correspondence that had precipitated Hartwell's death, and its mention confirmed Miss Marple's theory about their complicity. The remainder of the meeting proceeded with strained normalcy, though both women had clearly been shaken by Miss Marple's seemingly innocent observations. Their careful composure had cracked just enough to reveal the guilt beneath, confirming what Miss Marple had suspected about their coordinated deception. As the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple reflected on the success of her psychological test. The reactions she had observed provided the final confirmation needed to support her theory, though she knew that proving their guilt would require more than subtle observation. The challenge now was to gather sufficient evidence to expose their elaborate conspiracy while ensuring that justice was served for both Sebastian Hartwell's murder and Tommy Bond's wrongful arrest. The evening air carried the scent of autumn's end as Miss Marple made her way home, her mind already working on the final steps needed to bring this complex case to its proper conclusion. The morning brought news that threatened to transform Miss Marple's careful investigation from patient observation to urgent intervention. Inspector Craddock arrived at her cottage with the expression of a man confronting the collapse of his professional certainty, his usual methodical composure strained by developments that cast serious doubt upon Tommy Bond's guilt. The young man's solicitor had uncovered alibis that placed his client in the constant company of multiple witnesses during the crucial afternoon hours when Dr. Haydock's refined analysis indicated the digitalis must have been administered. "The timing simply doesn't support our case, Miss Marple," Inspector Craddock admitted with obvious frustration, settling heavily into her chintz armchair. Tommy was helping erect the Carnival booths from noon until 4 o'clock, with at least 6 villagers prepared to swear to his continuous presence. Dr. Haydock places the poisoning between 1 and 3 in the afternoon, which makes Tommy's involvement virtually impossible. He paused, running his hand through his hair in a gesture that betrayed his professional discomfort. "We're essentially back to the beginning, and whoever did this has had 3 days to perfect their deception." Miss Marple received this intelligence with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose theories were receiving overdue recognition, though she maintained her expression of helpful concern rather than vindicated superiority. She had anticipated this development, understanding that elaborate deceptions often contained the seeds of their own destruction when subjected to methodical scrutiny. The challenge now was to prevent the real perpetrators from exploiting Tommy's exoneration to cement their own alibis beyond challenge. Her response was characteristically subtle, yet decisive. Rather than immediately sharing her suspicions, Miss Marple suggested a small gathering at the vicarage that afternoon, ostensibly to discuss memorial arrangements for Mr. Hartwell, but actually to create an environment where careful observation might yield the final evidence needed to expose the truth. She specifically requested the attendance of both Miss Blacklock and Mrs. Vale, knowing that the stress of Tommy's impending release would force them to take action that might reveal their complicity. The gathering unfolded with the sort of strained politeness that characterized village meetings during times of crisis. Miss Blacklock arrived with her usual punctuality, though Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her hands and the way her sharp eyes constantly monitored Mrs. Vale's reactions. Mrs. Vale herself appeared more composed, yet there was a quality of artificial brightness to her manner that suggested someone performing confidence rather than feeling it. As discussion proceeded, through routine memorial business, Miss Marple introduced her carefully prepared test with characteristic gentleness. "I've been puzzling over something that troubles me about that terrible evening," she observed, her knitting needles moving with practiced rhythm. The jack-o'-lantern beside poor Sebastian seemed to have been repositioned after its candle was lit. The wax patterns inside were quite distinctive, suggesting movement during the festivities. I wondered whether someone might have used it to conceal something temporarily. The reaction was immediate and revealing. Miss Blacklock's composed facade slipped just enough to show genuine alarm, while Mrs. Vale's carefully maintained brightness faltered noticeably. Most significantly, both women exchanged a quick glance that spoke of shared knowledge and mutual concern, confirming Miss Marple's theory about their coordination. "The police examined everything thoroughly," Miss Blacklock said with forced confidence, though her voice carried an undertone of question rather than certainty. "I'm sure any irregularities were properly documented and explained." The defensive nature of her response only emphasized her anxiety about what might have been discovered. Miss Marple pressed her advantage with apparent innocence. "Oh, I'm certain they were most professional, though I did notice a fragment of what appeared to be peacock blue sealing wax near the display. Such a distinctive color, and it reminded me of the elegant stationery I've observed Mrs. Vale using for her correspondence." She smiled with gentle persistence. "The shade is quite unmistakable once you've seen it." This detail struck home with devastating accuracy. Mrs. Vale's face went pale, while Miss Blacklock's sharp intake of breath was audible in the sudden silence. The peacock blue sealing wax represented evidence known only to those involved in the crucial correspondence that had precipitated Hartwell's death, and its mention confirmed their worst fears about the investigation's direction. The remainder of the meeting proceeded with increasingly strained normalcy, though both women had clearly been shaken by Miss Marple's seemingly innocent observations. Their careful composure had cracked sufficiently to reveal the guilt beneath, providing the psychological confirmation Miss Marple needed to support her theory. More importantly, the stress of potential exposure was beginning to fracture their alliance, creating opportunities for the mistakes that would ultimately seal their fate. As the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple observed with interest how Miss Blacklock and Mrs. Vale separated without their usual coordinated politeness, each apparently lost in private calculations about damage control and mutual liability. The conspiracy that had seemed so carefully orchestrated was beginning to unravel under the pressure of scrutiny, exactly as Miss Marple had anticipated. That evening brought the final piece of evidence she required. Inspector Craddock's re-examination of Meadowbrook Manor's study, guided by Miss Marple's observations about the sealing wax, revealed crucial details that had been overlooked in the initial investigation. Hidden in the fireplace grate were the charred remains of recently burned correspondence, while the brass fender contained a small bead of peacock blue wax that had melted and fused during the destruction of evidence. Most significantly, examination of the study's leather blotter revealed the same indented notation found in Hartwell's diary. LB, final settlement. However, this version showed additional pressure marks, suggesting that multiple documents had been written on the same surface, indicating a more extensive correspondence than previously suspected. The physical evidence was finally beginning to tell the complete story of the conspiracy that had led to murder. As Miss Marple prepared for bed that evening, she reflected on the delicate balance required for the final phase of her investigation. The conspirators were now aware that their deception was unraveling, which made them both more dangerous and more likely to make the fatal mistakes that would ensure justice was served. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation that would expose 15 years of patient planning for revenge and the elaborate cover-up that had nearly succeeded in destroying an innocent young man's life. The drawing room at Meadowbrook Manor held the peculiar stillness that precedes revelations, though Miss Marple had positioned herself with characteristic modesty near the window where afternoon light caught the silver in her hair. Inspector Craddock stood beside the mantelpiece with the grave expression of a man who had learned that his initial certainty required complete revision, while Tommy Bond sat uncomfortably in a chair too fine for his station, still bewildered by his sudden release from custody. The two women who commanded Miss Marple's attention occupied opposite ends of the room like pieces on a chessboard, each maintaining careful composure despite the mounting tension. Mrs. Inez Vale had arranged herself near the escritoire with the studied elegance of someone accustomed to controlling situations through sheer force of sophistication, though Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her hands as she adjusted her pearl necklace. Miss Letitia Blacklock stood by the bookshelf with rigid posture, her sharp features composed, but her eyes reflecting the exhaustion of someone who had carried a terrible burden for far too long. Between them lay the accumulated evidence of their conspiracy, including the fragment of peacock blue sealing wax that had provided the crucial link in Miss Marple's chain of deduction. Tommy's release has clarified several important matters. Miss Marple began with gentle authority, her knitting needles moving with practiced rhythm. Dr. Haydock's refined analysis places the administration of digitalis between 1 and 3 o'clock that afternoon, well before the Carnival festivities began. This timing eliminates most potential suspects, including poor Tommy, who was occupied with set-up duties under multiple witnesses throughout those crucial hours. Inspector Craddock nodded grimly. Which brings us to the question of who did have access to Mr. Hartwell during his private afternoon routine, and who possessed both the knowledge and motive necessary for such a carefully calculated crime. Miss Marple's mild blue eyes rested thoughtfully on Miss Blacklock. The diary entry, albeit final settlement, has proven most illuminating, particularly when considered alongside the correspondence that had been troubling Mr. Hartwell in his final days. Mrs. Sweeterman mentioned his agitation upon receiving that peacock blue envelope, and subsequent investigation has revealed the true nature of your relationship with the deceased. The silence stretched taut as Miss Marple continued with inexorable gentleness. 15 years ago, Sebastian Hartwell systematically embezzled client funds from your London investment firm, Miss Blacklock, manipulating records to ensure that suspicion fell upon you when the irregularities were discovered. Mrs. Vale, as his business partner, provided the authority necessary for their elaborate fraud, leaving you to face disgrace, financial ruin, and professional exile. Miss Blacklock's composure finally cracked, her voice carrying the bitter precision of someone reciting a litany of wrongs. New evidence had emerged that would have cleared my name and exposed their crimes. Sebastian's retirement to this village was motivated by his need to escape increasingly serious regulatory investigations. When I demanded a written confession and financial restitution, he laughed at what he called my naivety. The confrontation occurred during his afternoon tea, Miss Marple observed, when the house was quiet and his habits predictable. Your knowledge of pharmaceutical dosages, gained during your London career, enabled precise calculation of the fatal amount of digitalis. The delayed action provided perfect alibi opportunities, allowing you to return to the Carnival with apparent innocence. Mrs. Vale's careful composure had begun to disintegrate, her city's sophistication no match for the inexorable progression of revealed truth. When Sebastian collapsed at the Carnival, it created new dangers, Miss Marple continued, turning her attention to the elegant woman. Your correspondence had left traces that could expose the conspiracy. The peacock blue sealing wax fragment found beneath the jack-o'-lantern tells the story of your frantic attempt to destroy evidence during the chaos of the emergency. The physical evidence supported Miss Marple's reconstruction with devastating clarity. The charred remains in the manor's fireplace, the bead of wax fused to the brass fender, and the inconsistent wax patterns inside the carved pumpkin all spoke of hasty destruction and repositioning during the Carnival's confusion. Mrs. Vale's intimate knowledge of Hartwell's daily routines, revealed through her casual mentions of his morning walks and preferences, contradicted her claims of distant acquaintance. Tommy's arrest provided unexpected protection for your conspiracy, Miss Marple concluded with gentle finality. His obvious distress and access to digitalis sources made him an ideal scapegoat. The bottle, hidden in the potting shed, was placed by someone unfamiliar with gardening practices, positioned for discovery rather than genuine concealment. Miss Blacklock's confession came with the flat exhaustion of someone finally laying down an unbearable burden. "I never intended for Tommy to suffer. When they arrested him, I told myself the truth would emerge eventually. But Inez panicked, convinced that his release would expose our involvement." As Inspector Craddock began the formal procedures that would bring the case to its proper conclusion, Miss Marple reflected on the terrible irony of justice corrupted by its own pursuit. Miss Blacklock's grievances had been entirely legitimate, her desire for vindication completely justified. Yet the methods chosen to achieve that justice had transformed victim into perpetrator, creating new tragedies that could never fully restore what had been lost to 15 years of calculated cruelty and patient revenge. The formal confession that followed Miss Marple's revelation transformed Meadowbrook Manor's elegant drawing room into something resembling a courtroom where 15 years of accumulated grievances finally received their proper hearing. Inspector Craddock approached the proceedings with his characteristic methodical precision, though the emotional weight of the admissions lent gravity to each carefully documented statement. Miss Blacklock's account emerged in measured sentences that revealed both the extent of planning that had preceded Sebastian Hartwell's death and the desperate improvisation that had followed Tommy Bond's wrongful arrest. The conspiracy had begun with Miss Blacklock's discovery that new regulatory investigations were finally exposing the financial manipulations that had destroyed her career, providing the vindication she had sought for 15 years while confirming the bitter knowledge that her exile and disgrace had been entirely unnecessary. Mrs. Vale's participation had been motivated by immediate concerns about her own legal vulnerability as Hartwell's former business partner. Her presence at the manor designed to coordinate their response to the emerging threat through additional payments or other inducements to secure continued silence. As Inspector Craddock completed the formal arrest procedures, a profound silence settled over the room, broken only by Mrs. Vale's quiet sobbing and the scratch of official pens documenting the end of an elaborate deception. Tommy Bond, still reeling from his sudden exoneration, could only stare with the bewildered expression of someone whose nightmare had dissolved into an even more chilling reality. The knowledge that he had been a pawn in a game of revenge, his life nearly ruined by a carefully orchestrated deception, would leave scars that extended far beyond his brief imprisonment. Word of the true circumstances spread through St. Mary Mead with the peculiar velocity that accompanies shocking revelations in small communities, eclipsing even the initial impact of Hartwell's death. The village, which had so readily condemned Tommy based on circumstantial evidence and social prejudice, now grappled with a collective sense of guilt that manifested in awkward gestures of reconciliation. Mrs. Bantry arrived at Tommy's cottage with an elaborate basket of preserves and a lengthy discourse on the unreliability of modern investigative methods, which was her way of requesting forgiveness without actually pronouncing the word. Mrs. Price Ridley, whose eyewitness account of the argument had seemed so damning, found herself quietly replaying the confrontation she had observed, realizing how easily she had misinterpreted the true nature of the animosity between employer and employee. The physical remnants of the Halloween Carnival, still awaiting collection from the village green, now seemed to mock their lost innocence with hollow grins and faded decorations. The cheerful orange bunting and carved pumpkins that had once symbolized community celebration were transformed into poignant reminders of how darkness could fester beneath the surface of their peaceful existence. The realization that Miss Blacklock, a trusted, if reclusive member of their community, had harbored such a long-standing deadly grudge, while Mrs. Vale had played the role of grieving friend, shook the foundations of their collective trust in ways that would require years to rebuild. Dr. Haydock's final report, shared with appropriate discretion this time and confirmed by the Home Office pathologist, stated what Miss Marple had already deduced through careful observation of human behavior rather than scientific analysis. The digitalis had been administered with afternoon tea, its concentration calculated by someone who understood both pharmaceutical dosages and the delayed cardiac effects that would provide perfect alibis. The method spoke not just of technical knowledge, but of a mind poisoned by 15 years of injustice seeking symmetry in its revenge. Practical matters required attention as the immediate crisis subsided into administrative resolution. Meadowbrook Manor stood with its curtains half drawn, while London solicitors catalogued its contents with the impartiality of people who handled both treasures and betrayals as mere inventory items. A valuable painting returned to Mrs. Bantry at a price agreed upon by gentlemen, while the vicar acquired 2 well-bound hymnals in lieu of charitable donations that would never materialize. Tommy found temporary employment through Miss Marple's quiet intervention, his gratitude stumbling before finding expression in a renewed determination to pursue proper horticultural training. The proposed memorial garden for Sebastian Hartwell proceeded with notably diminished enthusiasm once the village learned the true nature of his character and business practices. After considerable discussion conducted in appropriately lowered voices, the Women's Institute chose rosemary for remembrance and seasonal asters, while the vicar added a simple bench with an inconspicuous brass plate that avoided saying anything foolish. Significantly, no foxgloves were planted in the memorial arrangement. As autumn deepened into winter, St. Mary Mead began the gradual process of returning to its normal rhythms, though subtle alterations in the fabric of daily life persisted like shadows that lengthen imperceptibly as the sun moves across the sky. Children resumed their play on the village green with a restraint unusual for their age, their laughter carrying the slight hesitation that comes when games have been played too close to serious consequences. Conversations at the post office and in shop queues carried new undercurrents of caution, each familiar face now viewed through a slightly different lens where polite smiles might conceal deeper truths and casual remarks could hint at hidden grievances. Miss Marple observed these changes with the patient understanding of someone who had witnessed similar transformations in other communities touched by tragedy. She knew that such events, however devastating in their immediate impact, served as profound reminders of the complexities that lay beneath the veneer of ordinary life. The illusion of perfect village harmony had been irrevocably altered, replaced by a more nuanced appreciation of human nature that acknowledged both its capacity for terrible deception and its resilience in the face of moral challenges. On a Thursday of pale winter sunshine, Miss Marple walked the service path behind the church, where ancient yews leaned in like confidential advisers, and she reflected on the exacting economy of human hearts. Revenge, she understood, possessed a tidiness in conception that became inevitably messy in execution, its promised satisfactions paid for, with consequences that extended far beyond the original injury. Yet she also recognized that grievances left unattended could breed their own deformities, and that some souls were left so long in emotional drafts that they warped beyond recognition. The village's instinct for survival gradually reasserted itself through discussions of Christmas preparations and parish theatrical productions, while even the village green seemed to recover its natural contours, where pumpkins had sagged in their final decay. With the first week of December brought a pale, forgiving light to St. Mary Mead, as though the season itself wished to soften the harsh edges of recent revelations. Miss Marple rose at her customary hour and observed from her kitchen window the odd-eyed village stirring back to its practical duties after the final, solemn correspondence from London had arrived. The coroner's verdict had been recorded with appropriate gravity. Tommy Bond was formally cleared of all suspicion, and the Crown Court would hear the matter of Regina versus Blacklock and Vale when the new term commenced. The machinery of justice, having corrected its initial misdirection, now moved forward with the methodical precision that characterized all proper legal proceedings. Tommy's exoneration brought with it the sort of collective village guilt that manifested in excessive kindness and carefully orchestrated gestures of reconciliation. Mrs. Bantry arrived at his modest cottage with an elaborate hamper of preserves and a lengthy discourse on the unreliability of circumstantial evidence, which served as her particular method of requesting forgiveness without actually pronouncing the necessary words. Mrs. Price Ridley, whose eyewitness account of the argument had seemed so damning, found herself quietly replaying the confrontation she had observed, realizing with uncomfortable clarity how easily she had misinterpreted the true nature of the animosity between employer and employee. The young man bore his vindication with remarkable grace, though Miss Marple observed that his natural cheerfulness had been tempered by a new wariness that spoke of innocence permanently altered by its encounter with systematic deception. His acceptance of a position at the County Agricultural College represented more than professional advancement. It was a declaration of faith in the possibility of growth and renewal even after the deepest betrayals. When he called to express his gratitude, bringing a crate of carefully tended seedlings as a token of appreciation, his stumbling words carried the weight of someone who had learned that justice, while eventually served, left scars that would require time and patience to heal. News from Holloway Prison arrived through official channels and clerical discretion, painting contrasting pictures of the two women whose conspiracy had so nearly succeeded in its terrible purpose. Miss Blacklock maintained her characteristic composure, reading her pocket Bible and requesting newspapers only on Thursdays, as though maintaining some vestige of her former methodical habits even within the confines of her cell. Mrs. Vale, initially caustic and defiant, had grown increasingly quiet as the reality of her situation settled upon her, writing long, careful letters whose ink blotted at the turns where emotion overcame calculation. The Women's Institute's memorial garden took shape with characteristic efficiency, though the final design bore little resemblance to the elaborate plans that had been discussed before the truth emerged about Sebastian Hartwell's character. The simple arrangement of rosemary for remembrance and winter pansies spoke to the village's collective decision to acknowledge the dead without celebrating their deeds, while the modest bench provided a place for reflection that honored complexity without passing judgment. Significantly, no foxgloves were planted in the memorial arrangement, their absence serving as an unspoken acknowledgement of the role digitalis had played in the tragedy. As winter deepened over St. Mary Mead, the village settled into its seasonal rhythms with the determined cheerfulness of a community working to restore its equilibrium after profound disruption. The Christmas preparations that began in early December possessed an almost desperate festivity, as though the village were attempting to reclaim its lost innocence through sheer force of seasonal goodwill. The church bells rang with particular enthusiasm under the vicar's wife's determined direction, while shop windows displayed their wares with the sort of aggressive cheerfulness that suggested a community convinced that normal life had resumed, even if the conviction required constant reinforcement. Miss Marple participated in these activities with her usual quiet grace, understanding that healing required both time and the patient accumulation of ordinary moments that would eventually overshadow the extraordinary trauma of recent events. Her knitting needles moved with practiced rhythm as she worked on mittens for the church bazaar, each stitch representing a small act of faith in the possibility of restoration and renewal. She reflected often on the nature of justice and the ways in which human nature revealed itself under pressure, understanding that Miss Blacklock's quest for vindication had been entirely legitimate, while recognizing that the methods chosen had transformed victim into perpetrator in ways that created new cycles of harm extending far beyond the original injury. On New Year's Eve, as the village bells rang in the coming year with their familiar bronze voices, Miss Marple stood at her cottage window watching the lights in neighboring houses flicker like earthbound stars. She thought of gardens and their altogether human characteristics, promising order while delivering surprises, harboring both delicate flowers and persistent weeds, always requiring both gentle care and firm discipline to flourish properly. Human nature, she reflected, possessed similar qualities, capable of both remarkable beauty and devastating destruction, always requiring the sort of patient cultivation that recognized the potential for both growth and decay within the same soil. The Halloween Pumpkin Carnival would be remembered as the year when St. Mary Mead learned that even the most peaceful communities could harbor terrible secrets. Yet it would also be remembered as the year when the village's essential goodness proved stronger than the darkness that had temporarily overshadowed it. Truth, Miss Marple had learned long ago, possessed the restless habit of rearranging comfortable assumptions, but it also provided the foundation upon which genuine peace could be built. In the end, she concluded with quiet satisfaction, that was perhaps the most important lesson of all. When the vicar's wife attempted her experimental bell arrangements again, the resulting clamour sounded almost festive to forgiving ears. Miss Marple, who had learned long ago that perfection was not a prerequisite for love, threaded her needle through a stubborn hem and thought, as she often did, of gardens and their altogether human characteristics. Promising order while delivering surprises, harbouring both delicate flowers and persistent weeds, and always requiring both a gentle hand and a sharp eye to flourish properly.